We have, there is a guest today who is called Brian Minor, but there's nothing minor about him. In fact,
sir.
Some would say he's Brian Major.
Yeah, I think he majors in the majors.
Yeah, majors in the majors, or Brian Dominant if we're going by chords. I turned to complete loser in this episode, and I just keep making musical references that have no place. But just because his name's Minor, I'm like, I can't. My brain can't not think that way.
Yeah, there's times I'm blown away and truly respect your intellectual prowess and the depth of your knowledge. This episode's not one of them.
No, it's just it's like that episode of Up, where the dog says like squirrel. That's just me with the musical references where my brain can't shut it off. So he's talking about progressive overload, a really nuanced conversation about how to approach training. And I'm just like creating chord structures in my head.
Yeah, so the good news about this episode is it will really give you that contextual interference that actually has been shown to increase BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is when you're trying to think about one thing but you're distracted by it. Like Omar talking about chords and me telling you about BDNF, when we're actually trying to be talking about progressive overload and Brian Minor, you're very much lost, but hey, don't worry, it's going to make you smarter. Just like this episode where Brian Minor breaks down the true meaning of progressive overload, how we often get it wrong.
Yes.
And then we actually have a kind of a cool dovetail to talk about how powerlifting training has evolved and where it may or may not play a role in hypertrophy and how those two interact. And those who don't know, Brian Minor is a badass powerlifter and a badass bodybuilder. Yeah. He'll downplay both, but if you see his pictures or if you realize that he's competed in USAPL Nationals and hung with some of the big boys, even though he's not necessarily the biggest boy in terms of powerlifting total, he's bigger than 99% of us.
But he's a big boy, and we spell boy B-O-I.
Absolutely.
And he, in ways, is kind of Dostoevsky has that book, The Double. And he's kind of like your double in a way where you both are deep thinkers, you're cerebral. You've done powerlifting and bodybuilding. And in fact, recently you guys had a pickup game of bodybuilding where you compared physiques.
I would almost call it a fantasy bodybuilding game because right now Brian is not in shape. And I used pictures that were just recent and he had to use ones from like a year ago. Yeah. And that's my only defense because I clearly lost that game. So the fact that I'm like, oh yeah, well you cheated is basically indicative of my insecurity.
But who can dance better?
I really hope I'm almost positive it's me, but just given how bad I lost recently, I just don't have the confidence to stay up.
You don't have the confidence to say anything.
No.
I do think for everyone listening, and they heard our intro now and are both confused, aroused, and intrigued, they might be thinking to themselves, okay, progressive overload, yeah, I got that. No. Trust me when I say this. When I first encountered it, was Alberto Nunez, shout out to Alberto, who shared the article that Brian wrote about progressive overload. And I want to check it out, enhance my knowledge. And I read it. It really changed the way that I thought about progressive overload. And so I think some episodes have more immediate utility to your training than others. This is one of them. And then, as you said, how it dovetails off into overall discussion of powerlifting training, the progressions, how it relates to hypertrophy. I think everyone's really going to enjoy this one. So
I totally agree. This might actually change the way you think about your programming like today.
Yeah. And you might learn one or two new chord structures. So let's get it on. Yeah, wow. That's the new thing with guests in person. You get an honorary high five from one of the co-hosts of Iron Culture, Eric Helms. I'm going to describe. So again, we have a visual component for those that are on our YouTube. What's up? What's up? For those who are listening just by audio to the podcast, that's cool. I'm going to describe what's going on right now. Eric, for the second successive time, is being out-angled by Brian Minor, who henceforth we're going to each have a nickname because you're known as Brian Minor. I'm going to call you maybe Eric Major. I'll be Omar Augmented. We'll all have chord names, okay, associated with us. Some will be diminished and some will be dominant. But we're all here united under iron to talk today about progressive overload. And,
absolutely.
And why it's overrated. And why I think the conclusion, if people like the spoiler alert, Eric, where we just tell them, who wants to listen to an hour, 2-hour podcast where we, ruminate over all these concepts, think about them, talk a little philosophy, and then reach a conclusion? They just want to know what the answer is. And the answer is basically, Brian, GVT, German volume training, right? Is what we're talking
Essentially,
about.
yes.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Perfect.
Thank you for tuning into Iron Culture. I think we've done it. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, for those who tuned in to whatever episode came before this one, probably.
It's a
You
blur.
may be aware that I'm here at the time of recording at the Ultimate Evidence-Based Conference in Melbourne, hosted by JPS Fitness with a bunch of awesome experts. One of them, my friend, Brian Miner,
What's up?
pro natural bodybuilder.
Yeah.
Nah.
I make 3 figures every 5 years.
Yeah, buddy. Not from bodybuilding, too. That's just actually...
That's just when I'm in shape.
Right, yeah, that's right. Mostly from flex shows on the side.
Oh,
Yeah.
those pay. Hey, when are you guys going to Dubai next?
Oh, when are we going to have our Dubai Daddies, 10-year reconvention? Yeah.
Yeah.
We can't talk about that. We're on contract. There's too many Dubai royalty members who buy our flex shows for us to disclose that information.
Right.
But yeah, national level powerlifter.
Yeah.
Yep. Coach of powerlifters and physique athletes.
Yes.
Master's degree in exercise
Yes.
science,
Yes.
exercise physiology.
Exercise science.
Oh. So that's less impressive, but that's all right. Let's see what else. Owner of a Ford Focus,
Nice.
Dodge Ram.
Dodge Ram, same thing, whatever. And welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, both of you.
Yeah,
Big fan.
So I don't know if I should air our dirty laundry out in public, but I want you to know, Brian, that Eric did not want you on this episode. I said, "Oh yeah, Brian. I've seen him with Alberto. Alberto has spoken very highly about him. What about this article that Alberto keeps talking about?" And he said, "Stop talking about Alberto. He's dead to me. Brian, who? He's minor.
Yeah.
He's not even major." Anyways, I'm gonna hit you with a bicep flex before I go to Dubai. So I don't know if I should have said that out loud, but in the era of full transparency.
I was hoping you at least paraphrase it because that's exactly what I said. Word for word.
I believe it.
That's what we appreciate here at Iron Culture is honesty. Because once we clear the air, then we can progress forward, which is what we're going to talk about today. We kill these segues here. We really do. We really do.
It's nice.
So I think first, I know who you are, but I want our listeners to know more about you. Can you give us kind of just a brief rundown of what you're about and what's your thing? What are you trying to do in the industry? Who are you as an athlete, coach, man, human? What's the meaning of life?
It's a good question. I ask myself that every day.
Mm.
In the fitness realm, I am a coach first. I'm a full-time coach. Part-time athlete, competed 2017 last time I actually competed in both bodybuilding and powerlifting was 2017. I don't know when I will be competing again.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoy training. I love training, and I'm just waiting for the spark and the feeling like I can actually do my best and hopefully PR at a meet before I really commit to that. Working through a little knee issues. But outside of the competing, I coach anywhere between 30 to 40 athletes, and I own a blog, myojournal.com, which I should write for more often than I do. But so far, the feedback has been very positive, and the return on investment from each post has actually been quite high.
Let me just say, you're extremely efficient.
Yes.
And it's of a high quality, which is basically me saying you really need to take your job more seriously and post every day on Instagram.
I know.
This is your livelihood, Brian. Please take it seriously.
Yeah.
So
seriously.
I like to, I guess I appreciate the information that's out there. And I guess when I do come forward with information, I try to look at it from a different perspective rather than just regurgitating, information that someone can, scroll a few slides further and discover.
He has an artisanal blog.
Ooh,
Artisanal?
Yeah, you're an artiste. It's not just about providing content. It's about providing creative works that further not only the spirit of those who read, but your spirit is fulfilled in turn.
Mm-hmm. I try to confuse people and question all of their preconceived notions on a topic. Particularly progressive overload this weekend, and it seems to be working.
Yeah. I think that's the main plug. If you want to learn things, you probably want to follow me. But if you want to be confused,
I'm your guy.
you want to check out Brian Weiner. That's
if you want
the
to
man to
question
go
everything that you thought you knew, Brian's your guy.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to feel that existential terror 24/7, have an extreme case of depersonalization where you don't know who you are, what you are, why we're even lifting.
You are.
Yeah, why you are. Brian's your guy.
I am your man.
Yeah, your name
Absolutely.
should actually be called Brian Diminish then, for the music people out there.
Brian Diminish.
Brian Diminish. That's way better than Brian
just
Weiner.
Diminish.
Not even pen the past tense. It's a state of being. I love it.
I like it.
I love it. So you're a coach. You're also, a father, a husband.
Husband.
Owner.
Father of two.
Father of two.
Mm-hmm.
Owner of a Taurus.
Dodge Ram.
Bronco.
We're gonna get it. We're gonna get it.
Yeah, we'll get it. We
We respect,
2019 Motor Trend Truck of the Year, Dodge Ram.
we respect that you're comfortable
Except
with
it's a 2012.
Yeah, well, it's the throwback.
Yeah, it's a retro.
It's a retro, 2012 retro,
Brian,
which is also the first year that you started working with 3DMJ, where we got to meet you, which is awesome. Tell us a bit about your academic background, because you're not just a sexy body who has a confusing blog.
Yeah.
You also know science.
I do know science, but before that I knew construction. So my undergraduate degree is in construction management. And I went to Colorado State University, so there was a really good program for construction management there. And at the time I was very, I wanted to make money. Like I was probably more driven financially than I should have been, more so than following. I didn't really know if I had what passion I had at that point.
Right.
So I entered construction management, and they had like 100% job placement, like going into your senior year. And I graduated in 2008, so not a great time to graduate going into construction.
Economy was booming at this time.
So the 100% job placement was then like 15 or something. And
it's close.
I ended up working, I was selling basement remodels, commission only. And I would walk around and like they would cold call people and set these appointments up, and I would show up with this like basement briefcase of this wall. It was like these insulated walls.
They're like an inflatable wall.
So it's like someone I felt like John Candy in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles selling the shower curtain rings.
Excellent
So
movie.
commission only. I probably worked there for 2 months and made $400. So I realized that sales was not for me, especially if it's not something I believe in. But if it is a topic I believe in, then I feel like I can sell it. But long story short, I worked in construction. Eventually, I ended up going back to grad school. 2011, I graduated with my master's in health and exercise. And obviously, I had to take some prerequisites to get into school. But then I worked as like a cardiovascular tech in a hospital, administering EKGs.
Okay.
Which hands-on patient care, like,
not your thing.
yeah, I mean, yeah.
Look,
electrodes.
I know, man.
It's just
I'm a basement builder and a bodybuilder now, and not and I don't care about people. I care about muscles.
Yeah.
And not the biggest muscle that keeps pumping all the time, but the muscles that it gives the pump to, so I can get a pump.
Yeah, you don't care how they feel. You care about how they look.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I didn't like that. So long story short, I had this opportunity to go back into the construction industry as a project manager, and worked for an awesome company for a few years, and not really with the intention of coaching full time. Like I thought that was probably going to be my career. And 2014, I think, you may know Matt Jansen.
Yep.
He was part of 3DMJ at one point. He invited me to be a coach on his, at the time it was called Innovate Elite Performance, and I coached for them for a while. Things happened, and like the coaches eventually it dispersed.
Right.
Still on good terms with all of them, but it didn't work out in the long run. And I started my thing on the side, and then just eventually in 2015, I was able to step away from construction and do this full time. So it's an inspiring story of longevity and chasing your dream of sitting in your pajamas answering emails.
I feel like I just watched Rudy.
Yeah.
And
but he never got asked to play at the end.
No.
But like
no one hired me.
No, yeah. That's why it's like Rudy. But it's like Rudy 2, the return, you know? Yeah. Which, by the way, I will sell the rights to anyone who listens to Iron Culture at the low price of $5 million.
We're desperate for money around here. We could join you in that quest, because right now, you know, we like to act hoity-toity that we don't want sponsorships, but the truth is, you don't even want to know what Eric has had to do to support both of us. And Eric, I just want to say,
I saw him.
You.
That's why he had me on. I came into the apartment that we're staying at, and I caught him in a compromised position. So,
and he's like, there's 2 ways this can go. I can get exposure by exposing what you've just done, or you can get me on Iron Culture. And I went, Omar, I got it lined up. Best guess we're ever gonna have.
Yeah.
I said,
so here we are.
Yeah.
I said
under no pressure,
Coach. Yeah. I said, okay, this is 11 p.m. on a Friday for me, but I guess we could do this podcast.
And I said, hey, we either do the podcast or you go down in flames with me, and I tear down your reputation. So,
and so Brian Diminished is back on. So some people, you know, they ask, oh, what's your favorite mode? You know, Phrygian, Lydian, Ionian, but for you, it's beast mode. And progressive overload is the thing. I'm just going to keep throwing as many musical references as I can into this podcast to tap that 2% of the crossover of lifter musicians. Just really hit that niche. Brian, I first honestly got introduced to you. So Eric has extolled your virtues. I found out there was a member of 3DMJ I wasn't aware of, which I feel betrayed, honestly. But has extolled your virtues, and I read.
He needs to know every client we've ever had to feel not betrayed. Yeah.
Yep. And so I read an article because Alberto Nunez, fantastic hair, shouted you out and shouted out that article, Rethinking Progressive Overload. And as Eric said, I'm not sure if it's in our intro or we said it off camera, how he respects the way you think about things. And it was not only really well put, to give you some damn credit here before we joked and said that on your blog you confuse people. People come in with assumptions and they just leave confused. You actually elucidated a topic that a lot of people think they know. But when I read the article straight up, I was like, all right. Yeah. You challenge my preconceived notions.
Yeah.
And I like that. Okay.
I'm glad you liked it. That's really important.
Oh, sorry. There's a major leg on my part. So I thought I saw you were about to say something, Eric. So I'm like, I'm not going to interrupt my man. So I just stopped.
That's okay. That's why we have an audio editor, and or we'll just have a big lag because I forgot to tell Brandon, and it won't really matter. So it's all good. So, segue to directly what we were just talking about. So it's not a segue. I would love to hear, what do you think the current understanding of the average trainer is, or the average lifter of progressive overload is, and then what might be a better way of understanding it in a functional sense?
So I think the way most people conceptualize it is, well, the first time I was taught about progressive overload, I was kind of introduced to the general adaptation syndrome. It's like you have this homeostatic state, and in order to disrupt homeostasis, you know, whatever that means, you scramble up homeostasis by having
a spatula,
some type of like stimulus above that threshold. And then you have this alarm phase where your body's like, oh shit, what do? We better build more muscle. And they build more muscle, and now your homeostatic baseline is up here. And now in order to scramble up that homeostasis, you need to go up here.
Gotta do more.
And then it just rinse and repeat. So it's often conceptualized as the need to, like, the action or the requirement to actively progress the training stimulus in the short term, either session to session, week to week, or block to block, which a case could probably be made more for that.
But I've got to add load to the bar. I've got to add reps, or I've got to add a set.
Yeah.
Or
it's not going to have a
I'm
positive
not going anywhere.
adaptation.
Right?
So, which is not how it works. And I think a better way to conceptualize overload in itself is meeting or exceeding the requisite magnitude of stimulus that's required to elicit the physiological adaptation you're after. So with hypertrophy, it's the amount of tension or impulse, whatever you want to call it, the overall dosing of tension that is required to tip the scales in favor of anabolic pathways in the whatever time frame you're examining, if it's session to session, week to week, whatever. And so progressive overload then, like if you're, some people call some sessions, this is an overloading session. And I like to ask, like, what do you mean by that? And oftentimes people say, like, you're doing more than last time. It's an overloading session, when that's not really the best way to think of it, or I'll just say it's not the best way to think of it. Because you don't have to do that in order to elicit those physiological adaptations. And the way to conceptualize progressive overload is the observation rather than the action of being able to increase your performance is a result of those adaptations from what you did in each session. So it's the adaptations that are allowing you to progress, do that extra rep, add 5 pounds to the bar, versus the requirement to do so.
Because I think the average strength athlete out there, and I do think it's funny, like if I was to go back in 2010 and think about the seminars we were putting on with 3DMJ, I was basically saying in not so many words that it's really important to get stronger. That's progressive overload. And as a natural lifter, because we can't just do whatever and grow if there's all the assistance we have, that if we're not getting stronger, we're not getting bigger. And I don't know if I said it directly, but I was basically implying getting stronger makes you bigger. So what's wrong with that?
I think it's the other way around. Getting bigger likely contributes to you getting stronger, just with added contractile tissue and added capacity for force production. Whereas you can get stronger with an absence of like contractile, additional contractile tissue.
Not all strength means you got bigger.
Yeah, I mean, a good example is like a peaking phase in a powerlifting block. It's like volume may be at maintenance levels for muscle tissue, but you're fine-tuning that capacity for force production through neurological avenues. And diminished fatigue. Yeah. And so you're allowing fatigue to come down, you're like tuning the machine, so to speak, and then you're expressing strength with likely no or at least minimal increases in muscle hypertrophy. So the idea of adding load to the bar as a requirement of getting stronger isn't accurate, but it may be something that comes with the territory of growth.
Yeah, and I think the average person, or who doesn't really necessarily understand what that implies, may now feel lost. They think, oh, hold on, this whole time, I read Eric Helms' article, I watched Omar Isuf's YouTube channel, and it was about, hey, natural lifters need to think about getting stronger. But now if getting stronger doesn't make me bigger, what do I do? And I think the key element is then just to understand, oh, no, there's still utility in the observation of strength.
Absolutely.
But so how does one conceptualize that utility? If it's not actually the egg, but it's the chicken, or vice versa, what does that mean?
So as your capacity for performance improves and you're allowed to get stronger, like on the physiological level, what's occurring is like the motor units, the neurons controlling, innervating the muscle fibers that command them to grow, that cause them to contract. Each motor unit there's like a threshold, a theoretical threshold where you hit, maximal motor unit recruitment. Actually, there is a threshold where you hit maximal motor unit recruitment.
They're either on or off, right?
They're either on or off. But it's based on the size principle. It's based off of the idea that with increased force demands, both in the absolute sense or the relative sense and the
Relative to
requirement to
failure.
maintain force output, because these muscle fibers fatigue, and if you have to maintain a force output, you have to recruit higher threshold motor units. Well, when your performance improves, that means, or if it's related to growth, then that indicates that these lower threshold fibers are now able to they're able to produce more force individually, and now that threshold for recruitment is now higher. And so adding load to the bar allows you to keep your volume that you're doing, quote unquote, effective. It gives you the highest return. It ensures you're getting a high return on your training investment rather than, but it doesn't have to occur just via added load. You could increase reps and still achieve that same outcome. So it's keeping pace with the rate of your adaptation rather than...
So instead of chasing strength gains to make you grow, growing increases your strength, and then you have to chase it to keep stimulating.
So, and that's where there's a flaw in the idea of, like, the common way people conceptualize disrupting homeostasis is like impose a stimulus that's outside homeostasis. Well, guess what? Like, if you just did it, it's within your own homeostatic capabilities. So it's not like you're disrupting, like you're causing a physiological cascade through tension, but it's not something that your body isn't already capable of doing.
Right. And it's more of so the question is then, what does the lifter do with the knowledge that they're getting stronger? Where's the utility? So if you see strength gains, what does that tell you, and what do you do with it, and how do you actually operationalize it?
Besides posting about it on Instagram.
More. Yeah, exactly. If I need to make this into a meme, I need to know this stuff, right?
So if you're getting stronger, the first thing I look at is, are there obvious signs that this could be neurologically driven,
right,
or like primarily neurologically driven? Like, is it a new movement, new rep range? Are they a beginner? And if they've been training a while, if someone's been training a while, they're proficient in the movements and they're performing sufficient volume, like we'll quantify volume here as number of hard sets, then progress should be coming to them. And so if you're seeing the ability to add load to the bar or the ability to get one additional rep, what that should tell you is I'm already, like, my existing stimulus is sufficient in a relative sense to continue, or my set volume is sufficient to create the quote unquote overload stimulus to drive those physiological adaptations. So it's you can use it as performance more as a diagnostic tool to assess the efficacy of your program, rather than feeling like you need to progress. So you can take more of
it's not an obligation.
Yeah, you can take more of a reactionary approach, and that doesn't mean you're necessarily getting suboptimal progress either. It doesn't mean a reactionary approach means you're operating on the minimum effective dose. You could be somewhere in between, in the right at kind of the peak of that inverted U conceptually, and be able to just sit there and maintain it and arguably get better progress if that's the case by not increasing set volume. So it's not just set volume. It's like if you're, if you feel like you need to change rep ranges, in order, sometimes people will go from 8 to 12 reps and then they'll run a strength cycle with the intention of being stronger in the 8 to 12 subsequently, which there's some flaws in that way of thinking anyway. But if you're getting stronger, it's basically telling you don't fix what's not broken, or you don't need to fix this because it's not broken. Like, you can milk this for what it's worth and probably continue to make progress. But on an individual set level, you still, in order to keep pace with the relative stimulus, you still need to be performing up to, at least some point above that threshold for providing a sufficient enough stimulus to drive those adaptations.
Yeah, I think where a lot of people get hung up is that when they look at progressive overload as it's something I've adapted to, that's where they basically confuse their work capacity with what is necessary to make them progress. So I can't tell you how many times as a coach, someone will come to us and they're doing an astronomical amount of volume. And then when we want to drop volume, they go, well, I know that maybe I am doing too much volume, but I haven't dropped it because, well, I've adapted to this, so I have to keep doing this level of volume.
Yeah.
And I think that is baked into the assumptions and the beliefs they have about progressive overload. So how do you, I'm sure you've had a client come to you and say that.
I used to believe that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you talk someone off that cliff so it's not just forever all the volume?
I think there is a component of education that's required in terms of explaining, some basics of physiology and how muscle growth actually works. But I think if you understand that there can be too much of a good thing and that there's an optimal sweet spot, and I like to tell people, if we know that there's an inverted U relationship with session volume, which has been established, that's likely anyway, there's likely, I would hypothesize, an inverted U relationship with weekly volume, where there's a point where you're no longer you're going to be getting so much fatigue that it may, it could increase muscle damage to the point where you're not actually building.
It's certainly been shown in individual studies.
Yeah. So there is a point of diminishing or no return. And it's, if you're not, well, one, you don't adapt to the volume. Like, that's not how it works. But two,
if you do adapt to the volume, it's not hypertrophy.
True.
Right? So like,
it's increased work capacity.
Yeah. Your ability to do a lot of sets is your ability to do a lot of sets. It's not necessarily how many sets do you need to do to make your muscles grow.
Right.
Yeah, they're not the same thing.
Yeah. And I think the idea, a lot of it's ironic because a lot of people that, have this way of thinking with progressive overload, like I need to do more. They also are well aware and acknowledge that there's a range of acceptable volumes, like a minimum effective and a maximum recoverable or a maximum effective dose. And given that there's a range, that should tell you that it's not like you don't just, increase your volume and that homeostasis follows suit and is now at that line of volume.
Yeah.
The volume is controlling the dosing of the adaptation,
right?
The stimulus, and then hopefully the dosing of the adaptation. But there is a point of diminishing returns, and I think when you explain all of that to the athlete and say, look, you may be operating on the right side of this inverted U, and we could probably make better progress in more of a middle ground. And I've seen that a number of times.
Same. Yeah. And you, it's funny. You don't know, are they just progressing right now because they reduce volume and now they're less fatigued? But then if they then keep progressing, you know that they were basically functionally operating. Like if they're growing 2% per month, just to throw an arbitrary number out there, with, let's say, 5 sets per muscle group per week, and then they would grow 4% at 10 sets per muscle group, and then back down to the same value at 15, and they're doing 15, you can actually reduce your volume and grow more if it was enough to grow, but a little more than you could recover optimally from.
Exactly.
And even in the adaptation to that is, I'm better at handling the work of 15, but it doesn't necessarily change the stimulus required to make muscle grow.
Exactly. That's well put. And you said another thing that I think is worth pointing out. We mentioned that progress is reassuring in the sense that you're providing overload. So we also know that the balance between fitness and fatigue influences your ability to perform. So, some people may hear that and think like, okay, well, how do you know it's not just fatigue that's dissipating? And my response to that would be, if you're looking across a mesocycle that's, progressing the stimulus, and if you're performing up to your capacity for performance, and chasing, working up to what you're capable of, then fatigue should be climbing in that case across a mesocycle. So if anything, if you're progressing across a mesocycle, then fatigue should be inhibiting you from seeing progress rather than allowing you and accentuating the progress that's observed. So, if you see progress after a taper, it doesn't, like, that's probably not indicative of like, hey, this is, it has to be under the right context to necessarily indicate that it's a sufficient stimulus for hypertrophy.
Yeah. That I think that's the key point that a lot of people miss when they think about the two-factor model, fitness and fatigue, and the expression of performance and being masked by fatigue, is that, again, going back to work capacity, what fatigues you also makes you more resilient to fatigue.
Exactly.
So as you're increasing volume, it's not just this one signal. It's not a one-sided equation where your just fatigue goes up linearly. It's your body getting better at handling fatigue as well. Fatigue is something that adapts along with everything else, or rather your ability to handle it. And I think that's something a lot of people forget. And sometimes that affects all kinds of things. Like, oh, I'm a low volume guy, or I'm a high volume gal, or I can, like, this is what I can and can't handle right now. But you're not a static animal. That's the whole reason we train, right? So I think that's an important point. Omar, how often do you run into people who in the strength community get just really caught up with chasing the next number and feeling like if they're not, it's like kind of like this daily failure?
Everyone. I would say it's incredibly prevalent because I think there has been a oversimplified approach when it comes to lifting as a result of the medium on YouTube, meaning that you kind of have these sound bites, and the sound bites are what's necessary to try and convey some of these ideas. And so people will confuse or conflate some of these things where you were talking about previously, strength, strength driving hypertrophy, or vice versa. And people, when they're in the gym, as a result of being told constantly the need to get stronger or hit rep PRs or whatever the case may be, if even a week to week, if there's fluctuations in their performance, it causes an issue in confidence then of their overall belief either in the system they're following or their capabilities, meaning that a lot, and I would say it's also individuals that follow some of that more specific style training. So they do a lot of squat, bench, deadlift, where they have to work up to their weekly singles or whatnot. And it's like, oh, like I last week I did this and it was at a RP 8, and now this week I did a RP 9, but that RP 9 was less weight. Like, what's going on? Which is interesting because a lot of that thinking follows more just the concept that you constantly should be making progress, or that your numbers should be scaling up. I think it's as a result of the medium, and also people not understanding that it kind of works in a wave, your overall progress, that it's not just one of these things like this. And so I think one of the big issues, however, was, and it's almost like a Hegelian dialectics, I guess, where you have the thesis and antithesis and then the synthesis, where you had at first bodybuilders that would all say, you need to train bodybuilding style if you want to get big. What does that mean? It's like, well, you don't need, when I entered the YouTube scene, you don't need deadlifts, you don't need squats, you don't need these big compound movements. And then there kind of was a revolution that occurred where, as you said, Eric, we said the importance of strength, right, especially for a natural lifter. And so then that rose up, and then how strength has become part of the identity, or the constant chase of numbers and volume. And in a way, I could honestly, some of my content could be a little guilty in a sense of oversimplifying some of the concepts, where then people become too attached to the numbers or to a certain type of rhetoric, such as, let's say, following a strength training approach, where recently in the last 2 years, I've come under minor or maybe a diminished amount of fire for what I've been talking about when it comes to strength, how, if your goal is to maximize hypertrophy, that strength isn't the only answer and isn't the only avenue that you should be pursuing. And then how you organize your training. And it's been one of those things where there's been pushback now because it's so baked into the public consciousness of YouTube and of lifters then that, like, I'm lifting more, therefore I'm getting better, therefore I'm growing. Like 1, 2, 3, So it's one of those things, I think, where having nuanced conversations on a medium that propagates, dogs dancing, getting millions of views, like, it's kind of like it's just kind of hard, to do that. So I think that's where it's been very enjoyable, I could say, on my end, the podcast, where I see the immediate utility if people are willing to dig deeper. It's kind of like, hey, on the surface you might have fool's gold, right, where it's right there on the surface, but if you keep digging a little deeper, you have a more fundamental understanding, and then thus you have a greater utility of what you're learning. So I personally have enjoyed all the things we've been doing, and I think people can walk away with those things, and I think people are receptive to having ideas challenged. I could only speak for myself, like from 8 years ago, from the shout out to my boy John Berardi, talking just nutrition for a second, the peri-workout nutrition days of just slamming that protein and carbohydrates, and just knowing that anabolic window was getting smashed, to now, it's a journey.
Yeah, it's I like how you talked about fool's gold and digging deeper, because there are points where the distinction doesn't matter in a lifter's career.
Yeah.
Where the strength adaptations and the adaptations to training are occurring so quickly, and that certain models that are very simplistic leverage it without using too much volume, or don't take a volume-centric approach, and it works for a very long time. Like, I think putting a natural first-year lifter on a 5x5 or a starting strength is probably going to net them consistent progress in both strength and hypertrophy for a couple years. But then the problem is only when you get to that intermediate stage. And I remember myself, I'll explain my position, it was confusing because I had equal interest in getting strong and big. And I got into an off season where I was like, all right, this is going to be my next bodybuilding season. And this is where I actually found myself on stage in 2011 with a smaller upper body, because I was learning more about powerlifting training. I was becoming more savvy from a strength training perspective, but not having this nuanced understanding we're talking about of what the chicken or the egg is. And I started to basically go, all right, well, whatever I can do to make my upper body stronger will help me improve my upper body.
Yeah.
And what it resulted in is I started going on lower volume, more powerlifting centric programs with a little bit of bodybuilding sprinkled in to round out the exercise selection. And my legs continued to grow, but I actually lost upper body size. It eventually corrected itself because I was no longer able to get better. I got really good at benching, the action of benching. I dialed things in, my stroke improved, and then I hit this literal 6-year stall on my bench press that didn't get changed until I increased volume. And it was the kind of thing where I had equated strength gains with being causative for hypertrophy. And it didn't matter until I'd been lifting for, at this stage, 7 years, right? So I think there will become a point even where the practical distinctions, they start out not mattering. If you're in the realm of a reasonable amount of workload and you are getting stronger, you likely are, at least one component of strength is hypertrophy. And if you're training kind of with these intermediate rep ranges and multiple movements, your standard kind of power builder program, if you will, you are going to get bigger.
Yeah.
But then when you don't, what do you do? And if you believe that the only way to get bigger is to get stronger, it'll eventually fix itself because something will be the bottleneck.
Yeah.
But you're going to waste a lot of time playing with things that are potentially even counterproductive, like I did. Like, all right, well, I'll do accommodating resistance, or And I think the only time that makes sense is like, all right, I'm trying to restrict myself to a weight class and get really, really good, but that's something you do when you're at the world class level. That's something when you were trying to break the 300 pound mark.
So would you say in your experience when you increase the volume, so another way to think about what you're saying is eventually you're going to be limited by development for strength increases. So increasing the volume increased your hypertrophy, and then that increased your capacity for strength is one way to think of it.
Yeah, basically. So for me, and I think it's easy to use a case study model to describe this, is I did all kinds of things related to the neurological and skill development of lifting. I played with different velocities. I played with eccentrics. I played with partials. I played with a lot of ways to try to milk the system I had without ever benching more than twice a week or doing more than 5 sets per bench. So for my most specific work, I never got more than 10 sets a week.
Yeah.
When you really think about it. And that's some of these minimalistic powerlifting programs that were around in the mid 2000s and prior, was like the bread and butter. So for me, when I ran out of runway, which was right around like a 320, 325 bench at right around about 200 pounds, it was the best I did. The only thing that worked was when I started benching 4 to 6 days a week and doing 3 to 5 sets. So I effectively doubled to tripled my volume over time. I went 3 first and up. And that's when I started to notice that there was a relationship between doing more and getting more, and just very, very basic. I didn't do anything special. It was just bench more. And I started to, and this is when at the same time I was kind of understanding the same concept. So basically I ran out of runway on the other components of strength. And then once I started benching more and I actually visually saw gains, then there was value in doing the pure strength work again. Because I had, that runway had changed. I was a new body.
Yeah.
I went from a 325 bench to a 365 bench, touch and go. And that was very illustrative for me. And it was very important as a bodybuilder, because now, like, looking at my pictures that I have been posting this season, I don't look bottom heavy anymore. I finally look symmetrical, but it's been the result of literally doing twice as much volume on my body than my lower.
Yeah. And I think it's easy for beginner, intermediate lifters to oversimplify the idea. I mean, you success leaves clues type of thing. Like you look at somebody who squats 500 pounds. Like, I remember I originally started powerlifting because I thought, like, this is going to give me a denser, more like mature look. And
the Franco Columbu Arnold kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like, the idea, like, the fact that I was actually, like, deliberately, I think I was just more focused and organized and methodical in my training. So it helped originally, but I don't think it was due to the higher intensities. I don't think it was due to necessarily progressing the load and having that be the driving factor. I think it was merely the fact that, like, I started deadlifting. You know, it's like you're doing exercises that maybe you hadn't done. Like, I can't say that my bench or my chest got any bigger, or my legs probably got smaller, in fact. Squatting low bar. But the deadlifts are one thing that I think, just incorporating that exercise helped. And then, you see people are like, deadlifts, like, heavy deadlifts are important for back. And so it's like, or that they overstate the utility of them for hypertrophy. So yeah, I think, over time, it's almost, I think it's one of the reasons why I'm less excited about powerlifting now, to be honest. Like, I know it's not contributing to as much.
You ran out of Kool-Aid to drink.
It doesn't have to be suboptimal if you can stay healthy and, manage your fatigue, but it's a hell of a lot easier to get bigger through other avenues than constantly focusing on adding load to the bar.
And I think if we dial it back 10 let's say 2005, because I remember this is when the debate was robust because the forums were hot, where you had a camp of bodybuilders who said, you need to really stop worrying about, like, basically don't be a power builder. Like, don't chase the logbook. That's not what's important. It's about working hard in the gym and high intensity. And they were making progress, even natural lifters, because they were doing still a lot of things right, but they were incorrect. And then you had power lifters who were saying, look, if you just get stronger, you're going to get bigger. And they were incorrect as well. So no one actually had the critical piece. And that doesn't matter if it works, because both parties were getting bigger. Like, you're having two big guys yell at each other. And it's like, well, you both clearly have something right, but no one knew what it was. And I think in the bodybuilding camp, it is true that in the constraints of a reasonable program, finding a way to make it feel harder typically results in overload. But if you really don't understand what actually causes hypertrophy, you can find some ways that make it harder that don't make it more efficient. Like a lot of drop sets, creating a lot of central fatigue and not actually doing anything, doing a lot of quote unquote junk volume, doing more but having it be less effective as possible. And I think eventually, you don't make progress, you figure it out, but that trial and error is an opportunity cost. And then likewise with the powerlifters who are correct that if they're observing strength gain, overload is happening. If they get so focused on the strength gain, they can get lower volume, more specific training, maximize other avenues of strength, and actually either be losing muscle mass or maintaining it while gaining strength until they plateau. And it's when you plateau and when no one has the answer that you don't know where to go. So I think that's where the critical answer is. It's for the lifter who is attempting to make it past the intermediate stage where we all struggle, where if you're 5'10" and you're a male, that's probably like around like the 400-pound squat, 300-pound bench, 500-pound deadlift. If you have, I would say, slightly above average genetics, the kind of the person who probably sticks with strength training, that's like the I've made it, but I want to make it farther, but I don't know how,
So here's a counter question to that. Like, if you were to flip the script and say, if you're a strength athlete is your time better invested? Like, how much specificity do you in high intensity work is required to optimize that outcome? Because that's an area I'm really interested in, because a lot of the power lifters that I work with, knowing that bottleneck is eventually going to occur, that's a result of development.
Yeah.
It's like, let's take advantage of your, earlier training status. Let's try to get as much development as we can with enough high intensity work to, ideally, in combination, get the highest return on our investment. And I think that's an area that really interests me, is how much high intensity work, like what does the curve look like for that? At what point is there diminishing returns there where you're better off allocating more volume or more of your sets towards, or adaptive capacity towards hypertrophy work?
Yeah, I think Omar and I can both speak to this because we've been recently injured. I've had surgery. Omar's coming off of that this is almost better to answer on an individual biomechanical level. Because let's talk about probably the most impressive total that I've seen in the IPF recently this year among men, which is Taylor Atwood, just recently at IPF World. I know how he trains. He works with TSG, and some friends of mine, are like, Ben Escrow, Jason and Kedrick, my student, is part of TSG as well. And I've talked to Taylor. He's pretty open. You can see what the things he does. But you look at Taylor, and he's built to be a powerlifter. And when you talk to him, like when I'm 6 foot and I'm talking to someone about squats, and I'm 36 and I've had hip surgery, the verbiage I have around a low bar squat is like, yeah, it's really tough, or for example, my wife, who has really long femurs, and the squat's the hardest lift, and her deadlift and squat are really far away from one another. And what has worked for her has been the least amount of squats possible to build the skill, and then doing a lot of other work to build the movements. But for Taylor, Mike Israetel was talking about the fatigue stimulus ratio, and how most people would rate like a deadlift or a squat as like a 2 or 3, like highly fatiguing, causes joint pain. He wouldn't rate it that way. So there's also a Norwegian puller, I think, in the same weight class as Taylor. I'm forgetting his name right now, unfortunately, but one of the best deadlifts in the world. And I had a talk with him when I was presenting in Norway one time, and he was like, people say deadlifts are really fatiguing. I deadlift 5 days a week. And I'm looking at him, I'm like, you can scratch your knee without bending over.
Yeah.
So this is where success leaves clues only if that pathway to success is open to your body. You can accumulate a ton of volume and a ton of hypertrophy if you just happen to be the anthropometrical gift from God for powerlifting. But if you are just the average person, why would a barbell that was fashioned millions of years after you've become the human you are, that's placed across your scapula, your chest, or on the ground, be like perfectly built for you to accumulate a lot of volume? Why wouldn't it be individual? So I've found as a coach that I've had to find a way to go, right, what do we need for motor learning and skill development for you? And we were talking about this when we were making fun of Berto's lack of athleticism. Some people, despite his amazing body, he doesn't represent, actual functional movement pattern skills. Let me just put it out there, calling out my homie. Different people pick up movements much better than others. Yes. Some people can do a single once per week and maintain a very high quality, good looking squat. Some people need a lot more functional practice. And where that lines up with their biomechanical stress capacities for handling the big three is going to be some spot where then you have to figure out close variations, the right loading zone, the right intensity, and the right frequency, and then invest a lot of time. I think at the intermediate level, this becomes important into how do I build muscle. That's my long-winded individualized answer.
I like that. I like that.
Eric, I think you nailed it. That's the real consideration there when you take a look at some of those individuals that most succeed with that, not that type of training, but where the movements are as natural as possible to them, so they wouldn't rate it like you or myself, where I joked and people, it's like, well, Omar, like, you're only like 5'9", 5'10", like when you say you have long femurs, I'm like, yeah, relative to my body, like squats never felt good. Meanwhile, deadlifts came pretty intuitive, bench, and like wouldn't you know it, those shot up a little bit easier. It's like there's a reason why, even that when you spoke about low bar placement, where some of that simplicity of thinking, where for myself coming back now, having it in a higher bar position and changing some of the mechanics made more sense to me, despite like, you know, if not insulting Ripito or anything, but some of that stuff where it's like low bar is the way to move the most amount of weight. Like that's, or like if you want to squat, that's like, this is how you have to do, or even that, you know, amongst, we're like in the post, I love this conversation because we're now in the post powerlifting, where powerlifting has kind of rose to prominence and everyone's like, I want to be a powerlifter, where it's, you know, is that the best movement for you to focus the most amount of your attention on in order to elicit a hypertrophic stimulus? You know, like the low bar squat for the average person. Like, is it?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And it's also interesting because there are a lot of people who are not necessarily using one as a tool for the other, who legitimately want to be. And I think it's there's the assumption that people fall into one or the other camp. And I would say actually most people want to be big and strong.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's kind of the way it's always been. And we almost assume because there is competitive powerlifting and there is competitive bodybuilding, and that some of our fitness leaders in the iron community do one or the other, that people fall into those camps. But for the most part, I think people want to feel muscular and perform well and be strong. And just because people have to choose one, and a lot of us don't. A lot of us compete in both. And compete being a loose term, as everyone's gotten way stronger than us. But at least we've gotten on the platform, you know.
Compete.
Yes, exactly. But I think it's interesting because I do get to the point with a lot of my clients sometimes where maybe they started as a bodybuilder, started as a powerlifter. In reality, they just started as a lifter. And they might be competing in one, and I go, you know, we should probably just not do squats. And they go like, but I want to squat. I understand that it's not the best movement. And that's when you have to go, oh yeah, that's a thing. You know, like, okay, well, how do we keep it in a way that works for you, instead of then pigeonholing you into this hyper-specific way of thinking of exercises for hypertrophy, or a hyper-specific way of thinking of just to maximize your total, where you make poor decisions. Because then you get trapped in that optimal or nothing thing, where it's like, for example, like you were saying, Omar, like for me, it is true. I can squat more low bar, but I can also get more labral tears doing low bar. So how long can I squat more low bar? And the answer was found out back in 2013 when I squatted 225. When I squatted 495 pounds, that was the last time I'm probably going to squat low bar 495 pounds. But
did you make that lift, by the way?
Not in comp. So I
in
did.
Training though?
I did. Yeah. So I've done a 495 squat in training. I've done 222 and a half in competition, so 491 or whatever. And then in post-surgery, I hit a high bar 440, and my high bar, low bar always had a very consistent 10% less relationship. So I'm like, oh, that's a high bar PR post-surgery. So that's great. But it doesn't bang, my femur doesn't smash into my hip. So maybe I should just do this, even though it's not optimal.
So I think kind of what we're saying, it could sort of be distilled down to like the meshing of 4 variables that I can think of. It's like their biomechanics for a lift, whether or not it's intelligent to push, like is it going to cause a high stimulus to fatigue ratio, their existing proficiency in that lift, their durability, and then also their existing level of muscle mass. And I think you have to consider all of those together in terms of how you strategically allocate intensity.
Yeah, and then the emergent property would be the program. So if you've got, if Taylor Atwood 5 years ago comes to you, you go, we're going to squat, bench, and deadlift all the goddamn time, and then spits out 5 years later, oh my God, you would have placed third in the 93 kilo class, at Worlds, and that's incredible. However, if you apply that same rubric to Eric Helms, you go, oh my God, you're one of the very first people in New Zealand to get a bilateral hip surgery, and it worked out great.
Well, and it's something funny that you said, Eric, that I want to come back to. And we always get into the philosophical questions with iron culture, which I love, which is, the why do we lift? What is the meaning that we derive from it? You mentioned Berto, which is so interesting when you guys joked about his lack of athleticism. Where I have a funny anecdote for myself, and that is that growing up, I was quite athletic. My mom was a sprinter. I did the sprinting and all those things, and I enjoyed it immensely. And recently I tried, which is one of the results of the sports hernia, basically finding out quickly that all the time spent in the gym, all the years lifting has made me, as we define athletic, meaning my ability to move quickly, in this case, as it relates to sprinting, did not assist me in the slightest, where, you read the Canadian legend, Ben Johnson, his squat protocols, all these things. So I thought to myself, cool, when I was a 12-year-old boy, I was able to run the 100 meters timed at the City Track Finals at 12:60. I am now an adult who can squat 500 pounds, and I've been lifting for such a long period of time. Let me see what the utility of all the things I've been doing, only to find out that I'm actually slower now as an adult male than my 12-year-old self. Not only that, I'm not nearly as athletic in quotations, and by that I mean that that's also partially age, but just the lack of transfer of some of these skills that we think, where I was playing soccer at my old intensity, and that's partially with a quick little twist, how I felt a pull in my groin. I'm like, I'm slower, I'm less agile. Let me reframe the things that I'm trying to pursue. So just even our desires, how they could kind of change over time, I think is a very interesting conversation. The three of us, we're not shitting on powerlifting in the slightest. I call it, there's the postmodern era. It's like the post-powerlifting era, where I think one of the big appeals, and it's fun. It's fun, the objective numbers, and I love having that to pursue in the gym. But one of the appeals of powerlifting back in the day, and especially I think you guys sort of jokingly attested to that, is the fact that it was everyone's sport, where you could kind of train and you could be competitive in a way. And there, even the world champions, it's like you take a look at your weight class 6 years ago and you're like, all right, I'm within 10%. It's like not this.
Yeah, it's me.
Yeah, I'm within 10%. And so you had an outside puncher's chance, as they call it in boxing.
Yeah,
and
that's been my whole career, man.
Yeah.
So you hit your peak at 12, and
I'm like, okay.
And I think that's impressive, because you were doing something right. You got there early, perhaps an early peak, maybe. I don't know. I'm not confident, but yeah, you're so right that there was a point where the rate that I was progressing was faster than the rate that the field was progressing, and I thought, oh, I'm getting better.
Yes.
And then as powerlifting exploded, and the way I always define this was by the Wilks score required to enter the Arnold Classic. Mm-hmm. So the Wilks score required when I was chasing it was 375 when I first looked at it. I think this was 2013. And I was like, that's literally, I'm 371. I got this. Mm-hmm. And I started to get there, and we got around.
What year was this?
I think 2013 or 2012.
Okay.
And then the very next year, they bumped it up to 400. And I remember when 400 was considered, you were a badass lifter, mm-hmm. not quite world class, but you're knocking on the door. And I was like, okay. And I was out here in New Zealand now at this point, and I'm thinking, okay, you know what? That's cool though. I'm still a U.S. citizen. I could probably apply or whatever. I can do it. And I hit a 395 Wilks score, or 396 or something like that, very close to it. And the next year, it jumped to 435, and I was like, yeah, damn it. And I haven't even reached 435, and it's gone up again.
Yeah.
So I'm improving, but the field is improving faster than me. So relative to other people,
I don't know if the field is improving fast. The talent
more people
is improving.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's more people in it, so the mean has risen faster than I can chase it.
Yeah.
So my rate of progress is not progress if I'm using that external metric, which is always a fun, humbling thing. So yeah. Just, I guess the big message we're getting to here is that specificity should probably be specific to you mm-hmm. after a certain kind of requisite level of strength gain, and that's why it's important to not just be like, yeah, mad cow 5x5, or yeah, starting strength.
if you're close to the mean as far as anthropometrics, don't have prior injuries, and it's your first 2 years of lifting, that may very well be the best program.
Mm-hmm.
But then as soon as you hit that bottleneck, you have to dig deeper. The fool's gold will indeed be fool's gold and will not be accepted at the bank.
No.
You won't be able to invest it, and you have to think about this. So I think I want to dovetail back to some of like the practical application of this. So now someone who's listened to this is understanding what they might need to do to get stronger. They understand that they use strength as a diagnostic tool. When they're making strength gains consistently in a program, they're doing enough right to not change it.
Mm-hmm.
How does that influence progression models? Because I think what a big contribution in a positive way of the powerlifting world was to bodybuilding was that the crew of people who were just like, just work harder and you'll get bigger, don't worry about it. Yeah, you're right if it results in a greater stimulus, but what if it doesn't? Is that these progression models do ensure that there is an overload,
Mm-hmm.
but it may be an insufficient or greater than sufficient, or there may be a lag time before you figure it out. So what if we know that strength is now a diagnostic tool rather than the cause? What does that do to the progression models we hold so dear, like double progression or 5-3-1 or whatever?
So I think, I mean, I look at a lot of those static progression models that, arbitrarily add, like double progression, add a rep to every set next week, or add 5 pounds, or, whatever, if it's predetermined, no matter what it is, if it's a predetermined increase, it's not guaranteeing, like you may nail it. Like it may be the perfect increase in training stimulus, but
It could at least be in the ballpark, right?
yeah. Which for beginners, like it's going to work. But
yeah, everything in the ballpark is actually a home run if you're a beginner. Yeah.
But as you progress in your intermediate to advanced, like the rate that you adapt and your capacity for that performance isn't always going to match up with the incremental static
the attempted
increase.
progression.
So in some cases, you may see, a 5 pound increase may be, you may be able to get it, but it's accruing way more fatigue than you want to at that given stage of the training block. Or it could be that you're adapting very well and your capacity is now a lot more and it's undershooting the training effect that you're after.
And I can give an example of each one of those. I think everyone can relate to this. They plug in what they think they should be able to get at the end of a Shiko block, right? And the Shiko block is supposed to have you training at like 75% of your 1RM for 3. And it should be like, a 5 RPE. And then you come back to the same lift and it should be like a 7. But in like week 2, you're hitting 10 RPEs because you're like, no, but I should be able to squat 500 pounds. And then on the flip side of it, I think a good example would just be my dissertation study, where we made an arbitrary progression plan based on percentage 1RM, thinking that, and tried to match it to the RPE it's supposed to be based on a reasonable rate of progression. And the group in the percentage-based program had a static RPE of 5 to 6 the whole time. So it means their strength levels they ended up getting it chased away from them. It should have gone from a 5 RPE to an 8 RPE over the course of the program. It went from a 5 to a 5. So you can see either way, and they still got stronger, which is an important point, but just not as strong as the RPE.
Yeah, you may still be by our definition overloading, providing a sufficient enough stimulus for adaptation, but in those cases it's certainly suboptimal in many cases. And so a progression model that takes more of an auto-regulated approach, like using RPE, can be helpful, where you're like, I like to treat each set individually and increase reps each set until at a given load, until you hit the top end of the range, and then you can increase load for that set the following week. So it's essentially just a auto-regulated version of double progression, where you're not adding reps arbitrarily, you're adding reps on a set-to-set basis based on how you're performing and maintaining a relative effort. So say it's like 3 sets of 6 to 10 reps maintaining an 8 RPE.
So you stop 2 reps shy of failure.
On every single set.
Single set.
So say first set you do 100 pounds times 8 at a 8 RPE. And then the next set you do 100 pounds times 6 at an 8 RPE. And now you realize, okay, I'm a little fatigued.
Yep.
I'll lower the weight a little for the next set. And so you adjust to meet the criteria of the rep range and RPE.
So your constraints are, I'm training in the 8 to 12, I think you said.
6 to 10.
Yeah, okay. The constraints are, I'm in the 6 to 10, and I've got to hit 8 RPE, and I have however many fixed number of sets I've established is what I'm doing. And then you decrease the load if you fall below a 6, and you stop with the number of reps when you hit 8 RPE, or if you overshoot it, then you increase load.
Yep.
So then it just naturally...
Yeah, it just naturally progresses. So the following week, say you did on that first set 100 pounds for 10 reps at an 8 RPE. Then the week after that, you could increase to 105, knowing that you're probably still going to fall somewhere in that range. And so by treating each set individually, or even if you adjusted multiple sets at once, you're still only operating up to what your capacity for performance is on that given day, rather than undershooting or overshooting. So the only important thing there then becomes, am I performing a sufficient amount of set volume, and am I working hard enough within each set to elicit an adaptation?
And I really like that, because it's now we have one of these simple programs, like just like we talked about the value of like a 5x5 or like a template that you have. Like simplicity is very useful because it eliminates a lot of the signal versus noise. And now what you've done is you've eliminated the signal versus the noise, but it's actually based on the precepts of your own progression patterns. No longer are you chasing strength to make yourself stronger. You're literally observing your adaptation and the strength you're achieving, and then chasing it to make sure that you're still providing an appropriate overload. And I think one way that I conceptualized this originally is, what if I only had a 200-pound barbell in my room and nothing else? Could I keep making progress? And the old Eric would have thought, well, no, I've got to put more weight on the bar and be stronger. But now that we know that, even as high as like your 30, 40 RM, you're still creating the similar stimulus to like a 6, 12, 8, or 10 RM on a set-by-set basis, I could just keep doing reps at failure until I got to the point where 200 pounds was literally less than 40% of my 1 RM. And then it would start being suboptimal, because it's my body's like, this is cardio,
Yeah, exactly.
And I think understanding that is really important, because then you're less prone to go in a direction that is confusing that chicken and egg scenario.
Exactly. And I think another way to look at that example is it can explain how some of the bodybuilders, like the Just Work Hard crew, is still able to make progress. Because let's say those bodybuilders say they take each set to failure. They're going in, they're taking each set to failure. They're operating within their physiological capacity on that given day, which ensures they're at least covered on the stimulus side, assuming two things. One, they're performing sufficient number of sets for an adequate dosing of that tension, and two, they're proficient enough in the movement to actually reach full motor unit recruitment, which I think we know that can be a limiting factor, in terms of skill acquisition on a movement. But I do think, I think it's a little overblown, and I don't have research. Maybe you have some research to back that up. But I mean, it's known that many of the early strength adaptations in beginners are neurologically driven, as opposed to, increases in hypertrophy. But I feel like it's, especially if these bodybuilders are if you get into a hammer strength incline, like you figure shit out within 2 sets.
Especially if you've been around the gym for a while. Yeah. With any kind of movement rotation.
Yeah. So one advantage to this is, I mean, if you're performing, even if you had a wildly variable exercise selection, if you're proficient enough to maximize recruitment, you're performing sufficient number of set volume, then you're likely going to grow.
Yeah.
And one advantage to using then performance as an assessment tool is then, say every third week you circle back to the same exercise. If 6 months later, on each time you circle back to that exercise, you're able to do an additional rep or add load, then that's probably a good sign that hypertrophy is occurring, because
you didn't get better at it.
You didn't get better at it. It's not going to be, defined or explained by neurological adaptation. So, I mean, I've considered doing that. I mean, just to make training fun again. Not that I hate training right now, but like just to make it interesting and, give myself a list of movements, maybe 5 options for each movement pattern, and not even assign an intent, rep range. Just say, okay, one of these movements for 3 sets times whatever, stopping 2 reps shy of failure.
Yeah.
And then just broing it out from there.
Yeah, just having an RPE target and seeing if you can improve. And I will give you that piece of research because I know you asked for it, and I do have it. Mm-hmm. And it's a study by Rausch and colleagues where they compared auto-regulated exercise selection versus fixed exercise selection. And it was really good. It came out, I think, in 2017. We covered it in mass. And basically, they gave one group free reign to choose for each given muscle group a movement. And so they had variable rotations on it, and they were the group that actually made greater progress on the fixed.
It's an indirect evidence that they were achieving sufficient recruitment.
Correct. Okay. And it tells you that if you did, like, it doesn't prove the that coming back to it indicates you're bigger, but it did prove that based on that assumption, creating a model produced better hypertrophy and strength.
Yep.
So at least the application of it seems to hold true. And I think that's quite freeing when you think about it. And it's one of those things that also, like, I can't tell you, and Omar, I'm sure you've experienced this as well, like as practitioners who consider themselves evidence-based, where there was a point where we didn't fully understand things, but we overcomplicate them. And someone goes to the gym and looks at a bro, but typically an experienced bro who has kind of their thing they do, like, and some things aren't evidence-based, but they have all the correct rocks in place, and they're continuing to make fantastic progress. And it's like, yeah, I work hard, I do X number of sets, I do these movements, and I just train to failure. And then this person's like, well, oh God, they take glutamine, they don't train frequently enough.
They train to failure.
They train to failure every time on every movement, and I'm using an RPE, DUP, wave-loaded linear periodization program. I figured out what I'm going to hit on September 15th, 2024, and I'm also making sure that I've timed everything that's appropriate, and the p-values were significant when I looked at that specific paper on trained lifters, but I can't progress, and they're bigger than me. And it's like,
they must be on steroids. Therefore, ergo.
Exactly.
Which often, sometimes they are.
Often they are, yeah. But sometimes so's the dude on the evidence-based train. Yeah. But and I think it just goes to show you that the fundamentals are just so key, and it's not about optimizing everything, but about making sure that the big rocks are in place. Because especially at the highest level, the difference between any progress and optimal progress is millimeters you will never be able to measure until you look back 20 years in the future.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I look at, individual athletes that are, this demographic that you're talking about that are looking at optimization. And in many cases, as you alluded to, there's so many other areas they can fix. Mm-hmm. It's like if you get the basics, if you I like the term master the basics. Like if you truly master the basics, like you're going to be ahead of everybody.
Yeah.
Like pretty much.
Would you say that one shouldn't major in the minors?
Absolutely not.
That would diminish you?
That would if you major in the minors, then I think like my epiphany of this is just coming out of insecurity.
Yeah. No, the hot take, Brian, is 3 wannabe failed powerlifters try and justify why strength training is not the absolute necessary means to get bigger. That's the hot take. That's the one guy in the basement, who I'm in a basement right now, coming up with the hot take for this episode is excuses, bro. I don't know anyone that can't bench 315 that isn't jacked. Like, that old adage where you hear that? It's like, I was the guy then that went from whatever my chest size was in 2012 to 2013, dedicating more towards a strength-based program. I benched 315. They're like, your triceps will be jacked, you're this, that. And I looked at myself in the mirror after I benched 315. I'm like, nope. Okay.
All 3 of the people in this podcast are less jacked than they'd like to be and have benched 315. Mm-hmm. So there goes that shooting star that we wished on.
Yeah. I just an interesting.
The myofibrillar hypertrophy.
Well, yeah, it was
sarcoplasmic. It's just an interesting hot take. I want you guys, now that we're just talking a little bit here, is a question for both of you guys when it comes to survivorship bias, and that is for a long time I would support and put out, or post, I should say, repost, on Instagram, older lifters that are breaking what we previously thought possible. Like, here's a 95-year-old man who's deadlifting 420 or whatever. What an insane amount at that age. And one of the things, unfortunately, I've observed from a lot of these older lifters is their training age. And their training age is actually not that high. And what I mean is that they are older, so you have 70-year-old, 80-year-old, 90-year-old lifters, but their training age is like 10 years, you know? Yeah. If you take a look at a lot of them, and that made me pause once again in my journey of what do I want to pursue in life in my lifting career, besides the anecdote about the athleticism where I'm like, I'm no better off than I was at 12. In fact, I'm worse. Like, I need to fix this shit, you know? One of the second ones I remember, because there's a guy, it went viral once again. Guy's name, I think, was Gus. He trains with a strength coach. Super cool. Retired at 65, decided he wanted to do something different. And so he picked up powerlifting, you know? And once again, it's like, well, here's Gus. Gus doesn't make any excuses. Gus is 70, deadlifting 405 for like 10 repetitions. I'm like, that's great for Gus. It's like, Gus's training age is 5 years old, though. Compared to, like, I wonder, I guess a question I want to frame to both of you guys, because you've both been in the Iron game, you know, a little longer than me. You've seen a lot of trends, is what are some of the core components for longevity in the Iron game for the training? Because you spoke, Brian, about your knee. You know how you are and were a competitive powerlifter. Eric, you spoke about your getting both hips replaced, and then I've had to overcome some things. What do you think are some of the key components for actual longevity in the gym? Because I think we romanticize sometimes as strength athletes, like, oh, Gus is lifting, like, you see Gus, he's 70 and he's deadlifting. I'm like, Gus has been doing it for 5 years. Like, we've been lifting longer than Gus, you know, and that's a sad realization I had.
I think anecdotes, like you said, success leaves clues. But if you're defining success incorrectly, like you kind of were, like you're putting someone up as a veteran based on their biological rather than their training age. It's better if you can find both occurring at the same time. So, you know, having had the pleasure of sitting down, and you were there with Susie Hartwig-Gary, who's been training for decades. Or sitting down to talk to Dave Ricks when I was at Worlds, or listening to some of the lifters who've been coming on the RTS podcast. Like, you know, he's been having like the history of powerlifting on there, and getting the opportunity to talk to people who are still making progress, or at least sustaining damn near their peak performance over the years. And one minor correction, I have not had hip replacement. I've just had FAI surgery. It matters. FAI is different. But so what I've seen, I think, is those observations are really useful, and I have seen definitely the same things reported in all cases, and it is moderation. One thing you will never find among some of these folks who are M1 or even just in their 30s and they started in their teens, M1, M2 lifters who are still really good and really strong. And I think you'll find less of them in powerlifting than you will in bodybuilding. Like, I see more bodybuilders have to change their training. Like, I've talked to a number of like WNBF pros and like your Marshall Johnsons. I haven't talked to Marshall, but he's a good example. Someone in his 50s who's still competing at the highest level, and they have definitely changed their exercise selection. That's really common for bodybuilding. But if you can find a powerlifter who's been training at least 2 decades and is still strong or getting stronger, they can't change their lifting selection too much. And there's some really interesting things that they've done, and it's almost always a using volume appropriately. Mm-hmm. And I think that goes right back to what we were saying, is it's not the mindset of I have to do more all the time. It's the mindset of what's the appropriate amount that I can do safely and that I can build on top of only when needed. And it is actually, it's almost, I would characterize it as across the board, a reactionary approach, not a proactive approach.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think my observation in terms of most lifters' bottleneck for progress in powerlifting is, joint integrity or injury. Yeah. It's not, I can't, I've already maxed out doing 2-a-days. Now, like, where am I going to go? Like, I can't do.
I train 8 hours and I hit my genetic ceiling, but everything else is fine.
Yeah. So volume is never the bottleneck for people. And Yeah, I think it's the dosing of the stimulus, and it's easy, especially for younger athletes, to, we look at research, we get that correlation, like, volume drives, strength and hypertrophy adaptations, and, like everything in the fitness industry, black and white thinking, and you think, okay, well, take the conservative approach, and they're like, well, I'm an elite athlete, I want to do what's optimal.
Yep.
And so you have to look and acknowledge that optimal has that can be defined differently depending on the time frame you're trying to accomplish optimal. So
Do you want to have an athletic career that was optimal?
Yeah,
Or
so-
an 8-week block?
So one really interesting observation I've had now that the talent pool for powerlifting is so big is, a lot of the stronger athletes are the younger athletes.
So the juniors.
They are the juniors. But what I've
Yeah,
noticed,
just to put it out there, to put some data behind that. So the USAPL qualifiers for nationals are going up like 10% every year. They're getting really high, and the junior qualification is the same as the open.
oh, is it?
It's the same,
I didn't know that.
and
Wow.
they base that on data. So it's just
Yeah.
they like class 1 is the top 15% of the class. Master is the top 5%. I think elite is 1%, and you need to be class 1 to make it.
Okay, wow.
So now that junior is the same as open, that tells you about the junior
tells you,
talent
yeah.
pool. Yeah.
And one thing I've noticed, with some of the elite level juniors that are 22, 23, like about to exit their junior lifting career, is that like very assertive, like, okay, now is my chance to leverage this acute optimality. And I can understand that. Like I can
Yeah.
understand that's
The
a
pressure.
case. The pressure, and even I can understand if you wanted to win a world championship or whatever, that I get the trade-off there. Like, yes, this may be a time to push it a little bit in order to milk that extra little bit of progress and truly optimize the 6 months before you turn 23 and have to leave the juniors if you're competing for something on the world level.
Yeah.
But then I've noticed that. Like I've noticed this 22 to 23-year-olds, it's like that's where I see the most quote unquote like careless volume.
Yeah.
And so which, like I said, there can be a case for, gambling a little bit on that. But fortunately, like one of the advantages we have of not being high level powerlifters is we don't have that pressure.
Right. Yeah.
But it's past that, I think it's like, okay, now I'm out of the junior class. Now I need to play like more of the long game, or at least and it's hard to teach, explain that to any 20-year-old. I mean, I think it's you can acknowledge it conceptually, but unfortunately it's like you have to get, some people have to get injured to accept it, and that's unfortunate.
It's also tough to know if the stuff I'm dealing with now, is it acutely related to what I'm doing now, or is it actually that I'm dealing with things that I did to myself 10 years ago? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know enough about, tissue adaptation and injury, but it is one of those things I think a lot of the time, especially with motivated athletes, who unless they're just extremely coachable and are in the right hands and are wise beyond their experience, so how would you expect them to take this mentality when it's competing with their competitive drive to hold themselves back?
Right.
But I do think to tie it back to tie your question to the whole purpose of this progressive overload thing, is that if we understand that it's really not progressive overload, it's overload. Induce a stimulus, you'll see adaptation. And then if you see the adaptation, which is getting stronger, it's been sufficient. And you don't need to do more than that if you start in somewhere in the realm of what we think is a reasonable program. And I do think that's where research is helpful. Like if we think, in all these semi-trained people, 10 sets was better than less. So, okay, I'm going to start you on a 10 to 20-ish set program, and then we'll stay in that range until you don't progress.
Yeah.
Instead of adding.
Yeah. And it's not, I mean, I think a lot of people hear this message as like being conservative and doing the bare minimum, but it doesn't even mean that. It means you can find that middle ground where you're making good progress. You're just not rolling the dice to try to get that extra 5%.
Yeah, I would say it would be a straw man argument to characterize what we're saying as start at MEV.
Yeah.
You start at your minimum effective dose and then just stay there until it's no longer the minimum effective dose, then do a little more. No, we're saying, hey, take a research-guided, anecdote-guided, because we've got decades of, like, here's a cool thing. I was reading Dave Draper's book, Brother Iron, Sister Steel, and he was talking about the programs they were doing at that time point, and they were doing basically a push-pull legs, training each muscle group twice per week, or upper lowers, training each muscle group 2 to 3 times per week, with a total of 15 to 25 working sets per muscle group per week. And that's almost exactly what lines up with what makes sense these days based on like 15 meta-analyses for what we'd probably have an intermediate to advanced bodybuilder or powerlifter doing. Yeah. And kind of like you're just, and that's him, like what he says is like this is where I would start someone who just came to me in the gym who's a bodybuilder who's like, they've won, 3rd place Mr. San Diego and they want to train with us. Like, okay, so it's a little beyond the volume what we would probably start a beginner at, a little higher frequency to accommodate it, and we focus on the main movements. And it's like that observation coming, especially in that this is him talking about the 60s too. So it's like he won Mr. World. I think he won Mr. America drug free before kind of the 70s came around, and then things started getting conflated with drugs. Right. So this is like an observation of 60 years of lifters being drug free who didn't really see much separation between strength and size. That's useful. Yeah. And it also happens to line up with what we're talking about now. So it's, we're not starting with minimum effective dose. We're saying use what evidence we have to start almost for, I'd say 9 out of 10 people in the ballpark of a little more than minimum effective dose, and probably not too much. And even if it is a little too much, like if you're a Jeff Alberts who responds really well but also gets quite fatigued, it's still like, it's where are you in that bell curve? But you're not going to be here, and you're not going to be here.
If you feel like you'll
overboard,
you'll know it, and you can dial back and still make progress. I guess that's the point we're making.
It would feel either incredibly easy, not just I'm obsessed and neurotic and I think I can do more, I want to do more easy, or you'd be like, I'm getting wrecked by these 20 sets per week, and you can dial it back. Exactly. And then if you're progressing, you're progressing. And I think that's quite a freeing and it's a concept that has a lot of utility.
Yeah. I think one thing to point out too is the absence of progression doesn't automatically indicate that you're not achieving overload. True. So if you're given, especially if you're performing, or even bodybuilders, strength athletes and bodybuilders, if you're going across a block and that fatigue level increases, you may see a maintenance or drop off in performance even in the presence of positive adaptations occurring. So I think when you're comparing performance, it's best to look at it through a wider lens. Like look at the same, if you can, if you're making progress each week, then it's obvious. Yes, you're presenting an overload stimulus. But if you approach the end of the block and say your strength stays the same or goes down, that does not mean increased sets, because that could very well be a result of fatigue, right, which the increase in sets would just exacerbate. So in that case, wait, be patient, and then you can compare your progress once fatigue has dissipated. So, you can compare week 2 loading to week 2 loading of the following block. Yeah. And so it does still require a degree of patience, and you can't expect progress on a week-to-week basis because of fatigue.
It still exists within a periodized model, is essentially what you're saying. Like we're kind of drilling down to the microcycle progression being this dynamic, let the progress come to you, but it doesn't mean there isn't training structure. Yep. It doesn't mean you don't have deloads. It doesn't mean you don't have blocks where you focus on different rep ranges if you have both hypertrophy and strength goals. And it doesn't mean you don't cycle through high and low stress periods. Yeah. I think it's just a matter of, all right, we take everything we learned about periodization, fatigue, and the fitness fatigue model. That's all still true. Just understand that the outcome of it is actually the existence of an adaptation or a strong indicator of it, not the thing you have to force. Yep. And then you can still keep all the same principles. We didn't destroy everything for the listener. It's all still there. Just know that if you got stronger, it means something worked. Yeah. Not I have to get stronger for things to work. Yeah.
And if you've used load progression as a means to overload and you've seen progress, it doesn't mean you did anything wrong.
No.
It just means you thought about it wrong.
Yeah, it's conceptual, and it is at certain times it doesn't matter. It's just a chicken or egg scenario. It's only when you stall and you have to think, well, what do I have to do? And if you're under the misconception that strength causes hypertrophy, that could lead you to doing less overload and being more specific. But if the goal is to use strength to get hypertrophy, getting smaller, like I did in 2011. So
hey, I wanted to say, Eric, that you basically gave us the soundbite for the episode, and I want to thank you because very soon we're going to be posting on our Instagram just quotes from episodes, usually by our guests, but in this case it's going to be you, and that is, if you're progressing, you're progressing, period. And so everyone's just going to misconstrue that. It's like, yeah, that's all right, that's the summary of the episode. It's like, well,
that's the depth we achieve and no more.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think, are we at that time point where we give the guest the opportunity to say anything that you feel should have been covered to have the nuance, and if not, all good, but just open floor to you, Brian.
No, I think we covered all the main points, to be honest.
If you're progressing, you're progressing. Trust it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Basically,
I love it.
yeah, but basically, yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, so you said you've got a blog. You said you do some coaching. Where can people find you?
On Instagram, my handle is @BDMinor, and minor is spelled MINOR, as in
Minor,
sufficient.
not minor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which it would be cooler if it was the other way. Because
would.
now it
Now you
sounds
gotta go
like
change
I'm,
it.
yeah, I'm suboptimal.
Correct. But you're actually digging deep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like a minor.
Yes. I like that. So @BDMinor, and I have a blog, myojournal.com, and yeah, you can access coaching information and everything from there. But
Awesome. And like you said, he doesn't have he's not the Stephen King of blog posts, but he is an American classic writer. Each time one comes out, I make sure to read it. I share it because they are always very insightful. It's been a pleasure having you on.
I'm like the Smash Mouth.
There you go.
Yeah, you're an all-star, baby. I was thinking of JD
just a
Salinger.
1 to
honestly,
3 hit wonder.
I love it.
Yeah, I was thinking of more like JD Salinger with what do you call it, Catcher in the Rye, where like you put out a work, and that work is going to influence the thought of the entire generation. But Smash Mouth did the same thing to a different extent, but it's no less valid, or all art is valid.
Yeah,
I definitely think Hey Now You're an All-Star is the same thing as Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah, they're basically what was his name? Holden Caulfield. He's basically trying to resist a lot of the same things that Smash Mouth was talking about 30 years later.
Yep. Equivalent works. And I think on that insightful note,
Yeah,
Omar, can you close us out?
Now for the closeout, I'm going to keep it with the musical themes for the 2% crossover of the audience that plays music and also cares about lifting, and that is, you can't major in the minors. In fact, you should be dominant in the majors to make progress, and you need to augment your training so as not to diminish anything that you're trying to achieve. I want to thank Brian for participating, for being here, for holding his microphone so delicately the entire time, where he's thinking about things. You can tell he's thinking about things. So everything is going to be linked in the description. This is Iron Culture Podcast. It's history, science, culture. We change up the order of those every single time. You can help us out by leaving a rating and review on iTunes. It takes 2 seconds, and it helps us tremendously in our war against the sex gurus in our class on podcasts. We're in the health category, and they're just absolutely slaughtering us. And on YouTube, if you leave a comment, we'll do our best to respond. We'll catch everyone on that next episode every single Monday.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.